Tonight we begin work on Unit 5, which starts with Chapter 7. Chapter 7 has a lot of new concepts in it. We're moving out of the active record phase of things, where we were working a lot with interacting with the database and building components, and now we're moving into another real important part of Ruby on Rails, which is a component called Action Pack. And a lot of the first part of this is going to be learning about components in the MVC structure that we really haven't learned about yet. Really what we've focused on pretty heavily in the last chapter or so was the model part, the M of the MVC. And if you look at one of the topics here, controllers and views, we are now going to start looking at the V and the C in the MVC. And a lot of it is conceptual. Now the other thing that I did is I went through with Chapter 6 this afternoon and plowed through and created a video, which I'm going to be posting, where I stepped through Chapter 6, rebuilt everything from scratch all the way from the beginning of the chapter. I tried to take an older version of the project and do a bundle install and upgrade it, and there were a couple of dependency issues that I really didn't want to walk the path of trying to fix to upgrade everything to the new version. So I opted for just doing the work instead, and the result of that work is in this zip file. So feel free for Chapter 7 to use that as a starting point. I'm not claiming that it's perfect, but it does have all the file edits in place. So there might be a couple things we have to tweak. We'll discover that as we go. As is typical, you should save your work from Chapter 6 and make a copy of it so we have a fresh starting point. So this is the version that I was working on, still in the blog folder, but I do have a backup here just in case I need to go back. And hopefully you guys haven't had to do that too much on your own, because I know that's kind of a pain. All right, I'm going to bring up our book up on the screen here and start plowing through the material. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this whole MVC thing that we're working with are some of the tools that work underneath that we kind of take for granted. Many of you that are sitting in this classroom, and actually all of you now that I look at you, are either in the web project management or have gone through that class where we were building real applications, mostly on WordPress. And one of the selections that you make in WordPress when you're building an application are what the permalinks look like. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? And what that basically does is, instead of having URLs that are, messy with database timestamps or ID numbers or some cryptic, file name, you get URLs that are basically clean, right? So you get something that maybe falls into a category and then falls into maybe the title of the article or the date of the article or something like that. And really what's happening in the background is the application is building the URL for you. And one of the byproducts of working with the MVC structure is the fact that we work with the C and the V part, the controller and the view. And that will, by its very design and by using this thing called the REST architecture, creates those clean URLs, and that's one of the benefits of working with these technologies. And really, the underlying file structure has nothing to do with what people see in the browser. So we're really getting that browser to behave more like an application, really, than a series of static files. All right. So Action Pack, which is a major aspect of Ruby on Rails, has a bunch of different controllers that you work with, and one is what we call the action controller. And the author goes into this description here comparing basically the interface of like a CD player or a DVD player to a website. All right, that's kind of an interesting correlation. So what he's doing is he's saying that you have this device, it's got all these electronics on the inside that do all these very specific tasks. And the old way of us building web pages is going into those files and wiring all the components and writing the code for all of them. But then the user just gets this really simplified interface where you got play, stop, rewind, fast forward, and they just push the button and it happens. It's very simplified with no thought of what's really going on behind the scenes when you hit that button. So that comparison is really kind of being used here to show that really a controller in an application is in essence a gatekeeper, just like the keypad of controls on the device. So we are on the web page, we click on something or we interact somehow, follow a link, press a button, fill out a form, and then when we hit that button and an action is happening, really what's going on is there's a file, and in this case you see there's a class file for CD player that really is the controller file, or the kind of like the gatekeeper for the application. So when you press that key, it really, triggers a certain method. So I hit the play button, and it finds within the class file the play method or function or subroutine, or however you want to look at it, and then executes whatever actions are present. In some cases, the action will just be put a different page up on the screen. In some cases, it'll have you interacting with the model and the database, doing a bunch of actions, and then putting something back on the screen. But the controller, if you want to think of the controller as kind of a gatekeeper to what happens within the application. So for whatever actions are happening within your application, you have to have some sort of a way to put the stuff into the right spots in the application to make things happen. Action view is the complementary thing, and these are often talked about together depending on what articles or sources you're looking at, because when you click something on a screen, you expect something to happen and something to come back to your screen so that you know something has happened, right? As an application designer, you guys are in charge of that and what happens, but the view, the action view, is the part that actually generates the HTML that puts the stuff back up on the screen. So one thing that they're showing as an example here is some really primitive HTML, right? No doc types or anything like that. But you can see that we have ASP style tags. So those of you that have taken ASP.NET will recognize these as ASP style delimiters. Yep, in Java they use it for JSP. If you look at, there's a number of different languages that use these. PHP, of course, uses the question mark. But this is basically saying that we're running code that's not HTML inside of HTML, and it will be parsed accordingly. So in other words, what that means is the server will run that code with the Ruby engine and then put something in place there that then will become HTML and go back to your screen. So like JSP, like PHP, like ASP, and a lot of other server-side languages, that's in essence what we're doing here. So when you put programming code into a view file, usually what you're doing is you're creating what they call an embedded Ruby file that will have both an HTML extension and an ERB extension. And I know that's coming up a little bit farther down, but basically what happens is we push the ERB file to run the Ruby code, and then when it's done running, it then becomes an HTML file, which basically is your view that goes back to the user. The advantage of this, of course, is that it's dynamic. So depending on how many articles you have and what the titles of those articles are, it will dynamically pull it in from the database or your model or memory, wherever you're specifying, and then marry it with the HTML, push it back to the screen, and therefore create your view. So what you might see in your browser after it runs would just be a simple unordered list. You wouldn't see the Ruby code, just like any server-side language. So, of course, whenever you're working with any server-side code, that's one of the advantages of it, is code hiding. People don't see your logic, they just see the result. And most websites that you go to that have logins and databases attached, that tends to be the case. So you never really see the programmer's logic unless they're doing a lot of stuff in JavaScript, and that's not always the case there either. All right. Now, working with embedded Ruby, you are going to start to see those ASP style tags, and you're going to see there's basically two different versions of these. And those of you, I know a few of you are already in that Java 2 class that's running concurrently with this, and you might recognize these tags because they're the same in JSP. that basically you have one that starts with a percent sign, and then you have one that's a percent sign with an equals, and they actually have two different meanings. So this one they're calling evaluation embedding tags, and this one actually is for output. So in other words, depending on what's happening and what you're putting back to the screen, you're going to use one or the other depending. All right, there's some additional components that happen in the MVC, and that is there's these little things that sit kind of in between the M, the B, and the C. So you get these, you know, the way I like to think of it, think of MVC as kind of like circles, right? And when we think of it like that, we think, you know, like the browser's happening, we call to the application to do something, it goes to a controller, the controller then says, okay, where am I sending this? Okay, we're just making a view, or first I got to go to the model. But there's in-between steps as well. One of those things is called helpers. So the little snippets of code that we write that sit kind of in between the controller and the view, typically, that intercept commands and do usually repetitive actions. So if you have a repetitive action that's happening, there's no real reason to have to write the code over and over again into separate components. You just write a little piece of code that you call upon, and we call it a helper. There are helpers that are built into the language, but there's also helpers that we create ourselves, and it's really kind of all based on necessity. Another really important part of this MVC structure is the whole concept of routing. So in other words, when we call upon a certain method within an application, what does it do? Where does it direct us? And notice that you look at some database-driven applications, and you know, WordPress is actually not a bad example. And in fact, a lot of websites do operate this way, and they have no concern really over how things are pulled in. But if you were, let's say, going to a website and you're pulling up an article, and you want to pull up article with the ID number of 1037, it just shows you right here in the URL what the get is. So you're calling a file, you're making a call to the database, and you're passing a parameter basically to pull down that article. Now that's not a URL that's going to be real friendly that you're going to remember to type in, right? So one of the things that's kind of neat about this whole thing is we kind of break that association really of like passing the parameters in like kind of a cryptic way and switching it to something that's a little bit more useful and easy to read. And from there, this is how we lead into this discussion about what REST is, or RESTful. And this was something that really is created independently of Ruby. REST is really an architecture that is applied by many different languages, and in fact it's most used by MVC style applications. So for those of you that are going to be taking ASP.NET 2 in the summer, we are going to be learning about MVC relative to ASP.NET, and in that architecture we use the REST approach as well for the very same reasons. But there are certain types of things that happen when we're moving data in an application that is really, frankly, a little bit more efficient in terms of application design and much more friendly for the user. The way that we move things in HTTP, and this is actually kind of important to talk about. HTTP is a protocol for moving data across the web, but it is what they call it's a protocol that does not store its state information. It is a stateless protocol. So if you're running an application through HTTP, that's kind of problematic, because one thing that you have on a full-blown operating system when you run an application is you can store the state of like user login, timestamps, and things like that. So when we're using HTTP, we have to do all this little finagling to kind of make it maintain those states. When you're moving the information back and forth through an application, there's really two main methods that you learn about as a web developer. You get post and you get get. Do you guys remember what the difference is between the two? It's okay if you don't.
Get was in
That's right. Very, very correct. So get includes whatever parameters you're like grabbing from a form and passing on to the next page. It puts it in plain text right in the URL. An example of that in a classic sense is you just go to Google and type in a search term, right? And then you can see up here all this extra stuff that's in here. That's part of the get. So when I hit that search button and pressed enter, that information is being sent to Google servers. Google servers receive it and then do something with it, right? And that's in the form of a get. When you do a post, that information is obscured from the URL and not visible. Now, unbeknownst to many people is when you are moving information in an application, there are actually other methods that can be used but are typically not used because of the structure of the protocol. But there are these ones that are called patch and put and delete, and there's actually a few more. But it's kind of interesting the way that they're used here. But notice that these extra ones do a couple of things that are kind of interesting. So this one actually edits the attributes of a resource, so we can actually go in, and if you think about how application structure is put together, in that we have classes and we have methods, and sometimes you're moving data in between those things, and then to have the capability of taking the parameters that you're passing and to adjust them is a powerful concept, but it requires that these different states. Delete, I think, is pretty obvious. It allows you to actually remove stuff. All right, so here they have a little bit of a graphic that I think is kind of useful here to understand how this stuff works. So let's look at the cycle that they have described here. Oops, a little too far. Trying to get it all on the screen, and probably should just zoom out a little bit. All right, that's pretty good right there. All right, so the authors identified it like this. It says the first step is that Rails receives a request from the outside world, usually a browser, yes. And it actually can, the request can come in from other data sources or devices. It doesn't have to be a browser. It's absolutely possible that one application is talking to another. That's one way that happens, or a database does a request or something like that. But for the most part, you have somebody sitting at a machine, typing in some information, clicking on a button, and expecting something to happen. So that request is then embedded and sent off to the server. It then gets to the routing engine. And the routing engine just very simply looks at typically the first part of the URL following the machine name. So if we had like example.com/articles, it would say, okay, what do I do when it just asks for articles? And then it'll go into its code and go, aha, when it's just this, then we'll take the application there. So, for example, let's say they do call upon articles, and the parameters for it, if we're calling for articles, is to show them, and what are we showing? We'll show the first article, right? So that actually happens in transit, and when it gets to the controller then will determine, by virtue of the same parameters, what it's going to do next. We might be interacting with the database, and just because we have a CRUD happening here with the model is not necessarily the database. Sometimes it's the instantiated data that we're using on the fly and not altering. Sometimes we're instantiating data, changing it, and then writing it back. It really just kind of all depends. And is this part of the operation obligatory? Absolutely not. Sometimes you do stuff on the screen that requires no interaction with any of the information in the database. It just is, okay? And it really depends. More often than not, it probably will interact to some degree, but not necessarily. Once it does whatever stuff it needs to do, the next thing it's going to do is it's going to determine which HTML embedded Ruby template file we're going to pump information into to then put it back up on the screen. So it'll find the appropriate template. So in this case, notice, and we're working with different folders now, so we're in the app folder, but now we're looking at the views, and we have various views for articles, and one of them is just to show one, right? And you can see it's show.html.erb, meaning it's basically an HTML file with embedded Ruby code, meaning the Ruby code like ASP or PHP or JSP is embedded straight into the HTML. The code runs, and then the file becomes an HTML file, and then ActionView will put it together and send it back to the browser. And then if you think about all those actions and how quickly they happen when somebody's on a website, you expect it to be like the snap of a finger. And you know what? It does happen that quick, because computers can operate like that. But there's really a lot going on in the background. Now, the thing that always, I think, confuses students initially when they're working with these technologies is why go to all this trouble just to put something up on the screen? And that is because we are creating something that is dynamic and can grow and can scale. So if you're building a simple website that's got 10 pages, that's one thing. If you're building a website that's got the capability of housing a whole bunch of articles, like blog entries, right? You might have thousands, right? So you don't want to have to statically list all those things for a user to be able to access them. You do it dynamically through your database, and by breaking everything down into pieces, we can set up, for example, the view to accommodate any article. It doesn't matter which article it is, as long as it fits a certain structure. And then if you want to change that view, I don't have to go back and change anything in the model, or anything in the controller, or anything in the routing. I just go to this file, change the HTML a little bit, and the whole thing changes for every article. So it's part of this concept of the separation of concerns, not repeating yourself, and keeping things into little pieces that you can edit and have a big impact. Same way like you have one CSS file for a whole website, you can change one line of code and affect the whole site. Kind of the same concept, but really expand it out to an application level. Truth is, real big applications, we're talking about non-web based ones, operate very much this way and have for a long time. So this architecture moving into web development is really crucial, really, for where we are right now. And this is the Web 2.0 world and beyond. Web 2.0, remember, being that world where you as a person sitting at a computer are not only the consumer of information, but the ability to interact with the information, leave comments, create content, etc. And think of how Facebook works. Think of how a blog works. That's kind of a microcosm there. So understanding that request cycle is pretty important, and you'll get the hang of it once you work with it more, and then it'll get reinforced when you take your ASP.NET 2 class if you're doing both. Typically, if you're taking this class, you're probably not doing ASP.NET 2, because that's really the replacement for this course in the new degree program. But I know a lot of the people in this class are following the old program sheet, and some people are throwing .NET 2 in just for a backup. All right. The next part we're going to talk about is the controller. So we're going to, break it down a little bit. But one thing you do is you actually set up a routes file. So that's actually in your folder structure. And if you, look at your application and dig in, there's a bunch of, different areas here. And notice the models, the views, and the controllers, and there's helpers. But there's also little files that are placed in other spots like this. And here's a routes file, and I'm just going to open that up in the editor. And you can see right now it's pretty much empty, but we do have one thing. It says resources articles. So we already have one route in place. Now, how was that created? Well, we'll talk about that, but that's where the file is located. And if you're really curious, you could, feel free to look at any of these files here. So if you were, for example, to look at like your application RB file and look at what's inside of it, this is stuff that applies to the entire application. And you'll see like some weird statements here. Notice that, well, first of all, we have a class file that's embedded inside of a module. Okay, that's kind of different. Then we see this like require. What does that sound like? Sound like any other languages? Sounds kind of like PHP. So you think of like PHP, you have includes and requires. And then if you think really more to languages like Java or C#, where you have like import statements at the top or using statements for C#, it's really the kind of the same thing. So what we're really saying here is we require all of Rails to be present within our application, right? So it's kind of like importing the Java utility library so you can run a scanner, right? So, and if we didn't have that in there, we couldn't call upon all the tools that are built into the language otherwise. Right. I'm going to close both of those files for right now and come back to it. All right. But what we are more concerned with is the structure of our URLs. So we can set up our URLs to respond to any one of the standard HTTP request structures, and the one that they're pointing out first here is a GET. Now in a GET, remember, whatever you're sending to the application is visible in the URL, and then you set up basically a generic structure. So notice the generic structure here. The first part of it is which controller are we addressing? Then what action are we taking? And then which ID? And from there we can actually drill down and do different parameters. Now for example, if we were to, in our browser, type a command like this, in the old-fashioned static HTML world, the perception is that I have a folder called Teams, and I have well, there's no .html in that. Well, maybe that's another folder, right? Or if you were thinking of like loading up the home page for Teams, you'd think Teams folder /homes.html, and it comes up. That's not at all how it works here. What we are really saying here is that Teams, the first thing that follows the machine name, is the controller entry that we're looking for. So there's a controller file that's going to intercept this and say, Teams, I know what to do with that. But further, it also says, well, if you say Teams/homes, that's equivalent to, let's run the Teams method and pull up the index file that's within there. Kind of interesting, right? You can even take it a step further here. You can actually send search parameters, and that's basically what we were seeing with Google. Now they're not using Ruby on Rails to probably power their system, but they are using a REST architecture to drive their application. And yes, you can pass search terms as well. And part of what we did in Chapter 6, there was a couple of spots where you were setting up scopes, and the scopes were really kind of like aliases. So you have like a keyword that then triggers a whole series of steps or a whole line of code, and basically what you're doing is you're saving a whole bunch of typing. But if you were doing a GET in an application and you typed in a search for Toronto, the URL would then convert itself to Teams controller, run the search method, and here's the parameter I'm passing. So not only are you declaring what code you're running, but you can also send information to it, and all of it still stays in a clean URL, very easy to read, no like question marks or pound signs or God knows what in there that you can't make sense of. So that's one of the benefits there. All right. You can also do things called named routes, and this is kind of similar to a scope in terms of the fact that I can actually create an alias for it to simplify it. So I'm not really much more to say about that there. All right. All right. Take a look at some more examples here. You can pass parameters. You can call a specific method. You can call a specific method and then trigger a method inside of a different class. And a lot of it, I think, is neat just because of the language is so clear and simple. He's got a little bit of a table here that shows how to use some of these HTTP protocols to accomplish specific tasks. Not something I'm going to test you on or anything, more interesting than anything else. The ones that are really kind of unusual to look at because we're not used to seeing things that aren't getting post are these three, and notice how the put and the patch also kind of relate to certain database actions, namely like record insertions or edits and then deletions. So that's kind of interesting as well. Fascinating, if you are running your Rails server right now, you can actually type in this command and it will show you what some of your routes and stuff are, which is kind of an interesting thing. But we do need to do a little bit of work here. So one thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to that config folder, find the routes.rb file. So let's go ahead and do that. Now I just had that file open. If that's okay, we'll find it again. So projects, blog, config, find routes, open it up in your editor, and then we're going to add to the very top here a couple spaces, and then we're going to say root. I'm going to say :2 equals bracket articles # index. All right. So we're setting up a route here so that we know where to send someone in the application. Make sure you save it. All right. Now we're going to actually go take a look at this particular file. So AppControllers article controller. So AppControllers articles controller. Now, question I will ask you, where did that file come from? Well, guess what? You know how that was created? Remember when we were doing our scaffolding early on and we were using the generate commands? Well, part of that process is that a controller is automatically attributed to a model. This doesn't exist in thin air. Notice that there is an application controller, so if you want to just open it up and see what's inside there, feel free. Not much of anything right now. But with the articles controller, the one that we're really concerned with here, you'll see that there's all this stuff inside of here. Where did this stuff come from? Did we put this in? Did we do any of this work? You guys remember doing any of this? No. So how was it created? Yeah, magic is right.
I bet it happened when we were starting to validate other stuff. We were messing with other files, so therefore it went to that file.
Right. When we did the generate commands, and you do the scaffolding, and you add a model for something, it automatically creates things to go with it.
Okay.
So for example, what those things are will happen kind of by default. So one of those default things is, for most things we get what we call an index view. So if I type in to the URL, whatever my website is .com/articles, that implies it's looking for the default method, which is index. So in this case, what is it going to do? It's going to show us all the articles.
Yeah.
Okay. But then if you look at these other actions inside of here, notice that there's a show.
Yeah.
Well, that's empty. There's a new. Well,
Yeah.
that sounds like a database thing.
An article. Yeah.
And this sounds like a database thing. And this sounds like a database thing. Right? So what you're seeing is you generate a model, it generates a view automatically, it generates a controller automatically with certain default actions pre-specified that relate to the CRUD operations that allow us to interact with the model. You can come in here and you can customize this stuff, you can disable things, you can add code, but what's kind of neat about this is it shows you what URL triggers it as well. Which is pretty fascinating. It also shows you which HTTP protocol triggers it. That's pretty interesting as well. Did we do any of this stuff? Nope. All automatic, and that's really kind of the neat thing here. Now, the thing that I'm concerned about is, are they having us do something different in here? Well, if you look really carefully, the answer is yes, right?
Yeah.
What is different between this file that we're seeing here and the one that we have up on our screen? I'll try to zoom out and do the side-by-side thing. Not what I intended. What are we seeing that's different? Anything? That looks the same. Well, some of these are comments, right? Anything with the pound sign in front of it that's green, those are comments. So those are really basically irrelevant. And really what you're seeing here, if you're seeing differences, it is because there's version differences. The content part of it looks basically the same to me. And I'm just very carefully taking a look. Well, maybe not so carefully, but I'm looking. And are we seeing any significant differences here? And notice I'm trying to be somewhat methodical. No. And really, there's no edits to make here. And if I read this correctly, it says you generated a scaffold for your articles in Chapter 3, and this generated a RESTful controller for article model. In addition to all the required templates, the generator also added resources declaration to your route RB file. So that thing that we saw that was an articles thing in the route file, that was generated by the scaffolding command. Okay. That's why that command is so darn powerful. All right. So the next thing that they're talking about here is basically the index action, and notice here, AppControllers article controller. Is that what we're looking at right now? Yes. So we're just looking at the index method here. So what they're really telling you is that when you are running your application, and I suppose that's something we could fire up the server and actually follow some of these links, because really what they're trying to show you is that when you are pulling this stuff up and you're calling for articles, it comes into the controller and it looks for the default action, which is index, and loads up all the articles. And then what they're showing you here is if you can look at the information that's being pulled back, it'll come back in a couple different formats. There's the JSON format, which is becoming increasingly popular, and you guys hopefully learned about that in your JavaScript classes. And if you look at the information in the background, and if you look at it in a JSON format, it basically doesn't do this XML open and close tag thing. Everything will be in set of curly brackets with key value pairs. So it's just a different data format. JSON, in my time doing this, XML initially was kind of seen as the best way to move data like this. And over time, because JSON is basically just an extension of JavaScript that leverages JavaScript's object-oriented nature, has really become the primary way that people are moving this kind of data these days, which I think is pretty interesting. So, one thing we could try, we can go ahead and drop down into our application and run the Rails server and try some of these links and see if it'll generate those views for us. So, and believe it or not, you can actually click the links in the book and they should work. So if I click HTTP localhost 3000 articles, of course first load is always slow because we're getting a whole application into memory here. Let it do its work. So there are the articles. And then subsequently, if you actually click on this link where it's articles.json, notice the format of the data here. Square brackets to indicate an array, right? And what's it bringing back? It's not bringing back all the HTML. What it's bringing back is the data that's being placed onto the page. So we basically have two articles, see the curly brackets start and end, and then key value pairs in JSON format. Now, if you read the description carefully, I'm not sure if the XML one will work, but let's find out. Yeah. And we don't have that tool built in, so we get an error. But the JSON tool is loaded in, and as I was mentioning before, JSON has kind of replaced XML in terms of its prevalence in moving data like this, just simply because it's so easy to work with and so many different tools work well with it. All right. Moving on to stuff that I think is more important. Sometimes you might put in a path, and one of the powers of working with the routes file is you can actually put in paths that do redirects. So you can actually have a person think they're going, let's say, to an index view, but really you're taking them to some other view, and that's done by virtue of this simple little command, which is a little redirect to, and then you can call whatever thing it is that you want. It can be a path, or it can be a class, or it can be a different method within your application. All right, I think we kind of looked at that. So now we're moving on to our next topic, but I think we're going to take a real quick break here before we do that. Let's take 5, folks. All right, we're back from our break, and now we're going to start looking at some of these embedded Ruby files and the templates that they create. One thing that they want us to do is kind of familiarize ourselves with some of the other folders within the app folder. And we were just looking at the controllers, but now we're going to go over to the views folder. And then you're going to notice when you're in the views folder that anytime you create certain entities within your application, it often will create certain folders in here. So for example, with articles, because we did a scaffolding command when we did the creation, it automatically created views for all the little components that match up to the things in the controller. So if you look at like the names of these files, where we have an index and an edit, and there's a JSON one in there, and there's a new and a show, and you should see now the correlation between those two files. So scaffolding builds out controllers, routes, views, all automatically. I didn't code any of this stuff. This was just created for us. And then if you just open one up and take a look, so for example, if you do this, you're going to see this combination now of regular HTML and embedded Ruby code. What's fascinating about this should start now to maybe look a little bit like maybe working like PHP or ASP.NET, where notice that we're not looking at an entire web page here, but we're really looking at a portion. So telling you in essence that somewhere else, and I guess where that is, in the layouts folder for the entire application, here is our doc type. Here's the actual header for our HTML file. So if I, like for example, wanted to have calls to certain JavaScript files or CSS files, or any custom code that I want to put either at the very top or the very bottom of the file, I can go in here, hard code plain old HTML or additional Ruby code. So you can see here that it automatically brings in meta tags, style sheet links, and JavaScript automatically. And there's also a section within here that pulls in what we call the yield. And the yield would be the parts of the other pages that are getting stitched in. So for example, when I call the article's index page, the one that they're basically showing right here, that just shows the articles. And it's loading up this code. This code here is the yield. So whatever we see here basically is going to get injected into this page here. So it's kind of like an include, right? Like in the PHP. So once again, things kind of being stitched together. So you can see like why it's helpful to learn PHP first, for example, before you start learning this stuff, so you understand those concepts. So very, very powerful approach. If you guys aren't already running a server, I still have my server running, and you know, if you look here and you actually do a right-click view source, now you'll notice that a lot of this stuff here, we didn't add this stuff in, right? We didn't add in these JavaScript files. We didn't add in these style sheets. We didn't add in these meta tags. Those are being generated automatically from that template file. If I wanted to go ahead and put in some custom code, totally could, right? So if you want to make your application look like something different, you want to style it a certain way, you can do all those things. But you know, the crux of it is that these pieces are being stitched together. The views that you see up on the screen are really put together in pieces and stitched together. Now this is the same thing that we were just looking at. We just went and did it ourselves without the book telling us to do it. So that's why it's helpful, just basically to know that stuff. All right, so we're going to actually do a couple of things here. All right, so it says open this new HTML ERB file and edit and look at the listings within them, and just take a real quick look. It's not actually asking us to change anything, and that's pretty important. So don't go making edits if you're not being asked. And that's probably one of the trickier things here. So this is inside the articles folder, inside the views folder. So let's open that back up, and then notice that they have a couple of things here. Notice that the new file looks a little bit different. Should we change it? The answer to that is what, do you think? No. Don't mess with it, because new version, new protocols, what's in there is what's supposed to be there, so you leave that alone. And the same is true with the edit file, if you want to take a look at that one. Same deal. So apparently with the render form approach, they added this call to instantiate the articles, and I'm not sure why that was necessary, but probably something to do with the underlying structure of the framework and or the language. So we leave those two things alone. Now the next thing that we want to look at is, okay, you guys I know have this conception now that when we're building these pages, we have kind of the application one, it's got the doc type at the top and all this, the JavaScript calls and all that, and then the closing tags at the bottom, and it's got a little tag called yield that accepts all the other content in there, right? And then we pull in whatever page we need into that section. But then we also have this other tool called partials. And you're working with a partial when you see this underscore at the beginning of the template name. And a partial is kind of like one step deeper into this wormhole, if you want to look at it that way, in that we're creating just basically very simple little pieces of code that get inserted into others. What are we creating here with this one? Well, first of all, let's go open it. I think that would be helpful. So we have a partial form HTML ERB. And notice, if you look at this, lots of HTML, lots of interspersed Ruby code. We're basically putting together a form, but this form is going to be called upon dynamically. So it's just a little snippet of a template file that will get called upon as we need it, if we need it, by other template files. So one template file is calling another. And why do we create partials? For the same reason we do includes in PHP, so that we don't have to redundantly create this code every time we want a form on a page. The form is pre-built automatically by the scaffolding, so anytime we want to interact with anything related to articles, this form will pop up. When will it pop up? When we create a new article, when we do an edit to an article, any one of those scenarios. So there'll be calls from those other files to this file. No changes to this at all or anything. But if you were to run this link, the articles.new, and it brings up the form, they do want you to look at the source, and they show you that what happens in that code then renders into what is basically just a plain old form. What's interesting is, well, I didn't type this. Well, this is something that means something to the application, right? And all this stuff is handled automatically. And if you look at the original version, these Ruby commands automatically generate these things. Now, what's interesting about that is when you're working with these types of technologies, whether it's in Ruby on Rails or ASP or whatever, you're going to start to see patterns from the tools and how they create code. So when you start to go to other websites and you do the right-click view source, there's little clues that will indicate to you what technology that you're working with. For example, whenever I go to a site and I see like an assets folder, to me that just screams Ruby on Rails, right? And you know, if I was working in a different language, I start to recognize, you know, the paths and the calls from those languages, and then you can start to like kind of decipher what tools are actually being used to do the work, which is a powerful thing. So just by doing a right-click view source to be able to understand where something is coming from. Now, in addition to these partial templates, we also have these things called helpers. And once again, this is part of this whole separation of concerns, breaking things into little pieces. And forms in particular have their own little set of helpers, and they basically have two different types that are indicated here. There's a form helper, so it helps basically attaching forms to the data that they're related to. And then if you are looking for taking that content and then pushing it into an output format, that have the form tag helper, and those have a separate little suffix that you use to do that. All right. All right, so they do a little bit of talk here about how forms work. I make the assumption that you guys learned all this stuff already in your HTML classes and all the various classes that also do HTML type things, so you guys know what form elements are, what tags you use, why they're used, how they're used. And you have to remember that this technology likes to follow conventions. And do you have to do things that, this way? Do you have to always have a label tag for an input in a form? In HTML, you don't. Is it a good idea? Some people think so, some people don't. Whatever it is that you decide to do, just be wary of the fact that we have tools that allow us to automatically generate those things by just using very simple keywords like this. And I better plug in before my battery dies. While the video is still rolling. I've had that happen before, and it's not a pretty thing for the output of the video, let me tell you. So I better plug in quick. But that's kind of neat, because that way, once you learn what these helper commands are, that allows you to basically drop in form elements without actually having to type in all the HTML to go with it. And that can have both pros and cons to it. But remember, these things are always dropped into the embedded Ruby commands. So if you want to do things programmatically, that's why you use them. ASP.NET, for those of you that remember that, it has a very similar set of tools that do exactly the same thing. So like you use an ASP tag and tell it to do like a text input field rather than use the straight HTML command. And the why for that always is because we want to do it programmatically. We want it to be able to happen conditionally and dynamically. That's why we have those things available. All right. There are entire website resources that you can look up to find that. All right. So what they want us to do right now is go back to the form and see what happens when you submit it. And basically what they're trying to do is get the validation to trigger here. So if my validation was set up correctly, and apparently it's not. Oh, okay. Notice what it's. Okay, you guys are not. You already got this mistake. Yeah. Yeah, it's in the errata. So this is one of those where I have to go back and I ignored my own errata.
Yeah, you did.
And that's back in Unit 4, right?
No, it's in 5.
Is it in 5?
Mm-hmm.
No, it's down here.
Oh.
It's right here. All right. So I forgot to do this. And isn't it handy that I have the fix? In some cases, actually, it's better that I ran into this problem. So if you guys copy my Chapter 6 code, you'll know what to do. Make sure I did a Control-C there. And all right, so we need to find that file. Which file is that?
User.
Let's see if I still have that one open. I don't think I do, so I have to go find it. So app, models, user. Oh, why isn't it opening? Okay, oh, it doesn't matter. And we want to, that's okay. It doesn't matter what text editor you use as long as it text edits and save. So let's go back and try that again. But isn't it interesting that it indicates where the problem is, right? All right, so let's
Well, that's actually really nice. Some programs don't do that.
I'm going to do a refresh here on this page just to make sure. And then hit it. Now my validation is working correctly. So that's just to show that that part is functioning as intended. Right. We had a whole bunch of validation rules. Now this is what's kind of interesting here, because really what they want you to do is they want you to look at the output from the server. And that's not something that, you know, as typical users we worry about. But if you notice here, what they're trying to do is show you, and this is true for any web server. There's always engines running in the background that log all the stuff that happens. So anytime you go to a website, right, or using some sort of service provider online, it kind of ties into our conversation, they have these big engines running, and most of the times these type of log activities are also recorded in files. They can figure out exactly who did what and when, and yeah, it stores a lot of stuff. Look at all this little bit of information it generated just from the couple of lame little clicks that we did on our website. Can you imagine what happens on a big giant website where there's all this heavy searching and querying, and you know, a lot of information gets stored, and yes, they data mine that information and then use it against you folks or for you, depending on your way of looking at it. But notice here the correlation that they were trying to do something, right, trying to create some content and trying to push it to the database, and this gets logged right in the web server files. They tried it and they rolled it back because we have things that are blocking it. So we tried to render a view, well we did because it pulled the form in, and then we go right back to the new page with different CSS applied to it, right? And all that stuff is embedded here, so we can see what was typed. Well, look, this person didn't type anything in. This is blank, that's blank, this is blank, and this is the kind of information that, like, you know, somebody that's troubleshooting problems on the server side can look at and figure things out. The user, of course, never sees this, but the application developers and the server admins do, and it really does help to identify why somebody's having a problem with something. All right. All right. All right, so now in this case, notice what we're doing. Assuming that all our information in the database is the same, what this is asking us to do now is pull up an article with a title equal to Rails and a body equal to great. Now whether or not I actually have that, do I? No. So what's their point then? Check the server output. That's the point. So the server output then looks and says, aha, this is what was sent. We're trying to process this. We're trying to interact with the database and see if we can pull something out. And, well, we did, but it wasn't what you wanted, but it did what we asked. That's the point there, that all that stuff is logged, even the stuff that's put into the URL. Those are passed as parameters, folks. All right. All right, so that's the point. Passing parameters is possible from the URL, and that's what they would like us to do at this point. All right, so let's take a look now at the code that they're pointing out, and this is in the AppControllers articles controller. And I don't know if I still have that open. Apparently I do. All right. So, and really what they're looking at here is the create method within it. So when we hit that button, when we're on that form, these are the actions that are triggered. The first thing they do is they take this here and they're trying to create a new article. So they're calling the built-in method called new. We're sending in all the parameters that are gathered. Where are they gathered from? They're gathered from the form. And they're storing it into an instance of an article based on the data model of articles. From there, they try to run a save command and then send a message back to the user that it was either successfully created, and then also run a JSON command that basically runs the code into the database. And if it doesn't happen, then it actually triggers the action new. And what does new do? It takes us right back to the form. And then it also shows whatever errors. So that's basically what happened to us. We went in and we tried to do something blank, and it doesn't like it. It took us right back to the same page, and then it displayed the errors up on the screen. So procedurally, that's what happens. Can you alter this stuff, and can you make it say whatever stuff you want, or make it do different actions? Absolutely. That's on you. But what Ruby on Rails does that's beautiful is they anticipate, well, somebody fills out a form and it fails, let's show them where it failed and take them right back to the form so they can fix it, right? That's common sense. These are conventions they follow, and that's why this stuff gets coded automatically. All right. All right. So they want to show you when you do generate those errors. So if I click new article, leave it blank, and then take a look, and then do a right-click view source, what they're really trying to point out to you here in this next section is how does it know where, how did it make that stuff red? Right? How did it show this, and how did that become what it became? Where's that pathway? You see this?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, what else? What else are we seeing here? Is there anything else here that indicates, I mean, what's making it red, for God's sakes? I'm not seeing any of that stuff here. Did I click on the right thing? Sure seems like it. So how is that? I don't see like a style being applied. How is that happening? That's the question. Well, all right. How that is happening is not actually here, but if you go to the form.html ERB file, you look at this file. So views, articles, and that form partial is what we're going to be looking at here, which is here. What it does is it actually has a little thing here, right? And notice what it does. If article.errors.any, question mark, are there any errors? Yes. And then what it does is it figures out which ones they are, displays a message at the top as to what the problems are, and then it goes through and it applies the CSS to change those and make them appear the way they do. So that's kind of like the pathway to do that. And then notice here that they have little messages that get embedded too, and those are what receive the thing that ends up on the screen to make it style the way it does. All right. Moving on to the next little section here where they talk about edit and update. And once again, these have a similar type of approach, but if you run the update command, it basically has a success path and a failure path, and very similar to creating a new article. If it succeeds, it gives you a message and then takes you to a place where you would expect to go. If it does not succeed, then it puts you right back to where you were and displays your error messages. And how do we know that it is sending error messages? Because we're calling it right here. We're telling it to display errors. What are those errors? Show those errors. Where are those errors being stored? Well, the truth is the server log is keeping track of it as well. It knows where those errors are happening. All right. All right. So now they're asking us to go in and actually edit some of the articles. So let's go back to like a view of the web page, back to the main thing, and we're going to hit the edit button. And then what I want you to look at up here at the top is the URL. Now I know that the one that they had in the book wasn't going to work because I know that right now I only have 2 articles, and the ID of one of them is 2 and the ID of the other one is 9, which does not correspond to the book at all. So if I were to type articles/1/edit, it wouldn't have worked. But 2 does, and then notice the URL, and really the main point here is to understand what the URL is doing. So the first part is which controller we're triggering. We're triggering the articles controller, and then we are looking up the article with the ID of 2, and then we're triggering a method called edit. So when we trigger that method called edit, it then goes to the edit template file, this one. Notice how this corresponds with what we see on the screen. What are we rendering? Well, the form. Where's that coming from? So what I'm trying to show you here is the pathway. When it says render form, it finds the form partial. It pulls in all this information and drops it in place relative to whatever article you're working with. Which article? The one that we're instantiating. That's what that means. Next, we're going to have a link to show and a link to go back. But the article it's pulling up, its ID number is right there. If I switch that to a 9, because I know that's the ID of the other article, yeah, so it pulls up the other one. So really, you guys realize what's happening here. This is equivalent to manually calling from an application certain methods and sending parameters to them, and then telling it to do something. All right, so I'm hoping you're starting to see the puzzle pieces fit together a little bit more now. At least that's my hope. All right, maybe not. Maybe you guys are just thinking about turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce,
No.
cheesy potatoes,
I am.
pumpkin pie.
I was thinking about how
Football.
chapter 6, and then you put food in my head. Why?
All right, I realize we're getting real close to the end of the chapter here, which is really exciting, I think. He said so optimistically, right? All right, so once again, they want you to take a look at the server logs and see what's happening when you actually do create an edit. So if you want to like actually edit one of your articles, go ahead. So and we're going to do an update. Oh, a user must exist. Who's the user? Ooh, you know what that is indicative of, right? Let's bring up our SQLite browser. That article number 9, has no user attributed to it. So not something to freak out to. These are, you know, folks, I realize you might not latch onto that concept immediately, but as you get a little bit of experience with it, you'll start to figure those things out. Yeah, so see, this one does not have a user ID attributed to it, and I know that I have more than one user. I have Mary in there now too, so I'll make that article hers. So go back to articles, and I'll just put in a user ID, because all the little rules that we set up inside of chapter 6 require that you have somebody creating the article, not just running it. So just throwing in that little user ID directly into the database, boom, it's fixed. All right, almost done with the chapter. All right, take a look at the server log. All right, there is one little error in the book. So I don't know if you guys are, trying to look at this file. This actually should be articles, not users. So if you're looking at the files, and basically all we're doing is looking. We should already have that one open, but this whole little thing that we're doing, it's all about working with partials. And what does dry stand for? Don't repeat yourself. So we create little pieces so we don't have to write the same code over and over again, folks. That's the whole point. We can actually set up, and the point here is that you can set up variables inside of partials if you want, and then use those partials to render output. You can also render entire objects. You know that you're working with an object when you start to see that @ sign at the beginning of it, so that's an instantiation of something from the model. And if you want to do a whole bunch of them, you can set up a loop, and you can have it do it in a repetitive fashion until it's done. Folks, that covers chapter 7, and then from here we're going to start moving into chapter 8. So I'm going to stop this video here, and then we'll get started on chapter 8.